My name is Denisa Livingston, and I am one of the delegates of the Turtle Island Association. And I am also from the Diné tribe, from the Navajo Nation, from the state of New Mexico in the United States. And I am also currently the Slow Food International Indigenous Councillor of the Global North. As Indigenous people, slow food wasn't a term because we are slow food. And so talking about slow food, is something, a new term that people were asking, what is slow food? But it's when we do talk about that, and where I come from as a Diné person, that is that wholesome, healthful food. And so when we talk in terms and translating the words of slow food into our language and into who we are, and then our people say, oh, I understand now, that's who we are. And as Indigenous people, food is who we are. Food is holy to us. Food is something that is sacred to, it is our identity. 150 years ago, the US government sent our Diné people to a concentration camp called Bosque Redondo, which is in southern New Mexico. And it is this year that we recognize that we are still here. Despite that, despite assimilation, acculturation, that we are still here. And we are still acknowledging, because right now our people are suffering from health epidemics. We have a high rate of diabetes and also obesity, and also contamination from uranium, the effects of that our people are sick and suffering from the abandoned uranium mines. The water is contaminated, the air is contaminated. The US government hired our own Navajo people to mine the uranium from our own land without any safety, clothing, or any protection. And so we are still facing the consequences now. When our people were released from Bosque Redondo, from the concentration camp, our people returned back to nothing. Their livestock, the agriculture, the food, their land, was taken away, and we returned to nothing. We are still suffering from the same effects today. People are trying to grow their own food, trying to find the uncontaminated water, the uncontaminated soil, and trying to rebuild their homes, rebuild their families, rebuild, what they had lost. And in my work, particularly with the advocacy that we're doing, we were the first entity, the grassroots organization, to write legislation to pass the first U.S. junk food tax, known as the Healthy Diné Nation Act of 2014, to put 2% tax on unhealthy food to address that we are a 99% food desert. We have 1% access to healthy food. And so when we're addressing this, we also made a sister legislation to eliminate tax on healthy food. So we wanted to place emphasis that we have an overwhelming abundance of unhealthy food, junk food. And this is something that was so critical, because when we go to the stores, when we go home, there is no healthy food. We have a lack of farms, we have a lack of agriculture, we have a lack of practices, because of the history. And so we are still addressing that now. And so with the sister law, what we did was eliminate tax on healthy food, and that was an emphasis on our own cultural healthy food, like sumac berry, the 3-leaf sumac that we have, and then also, our beans and our corn, our squash, all of the healthful foods, that we have in Navajo, and of course the surrounding areas, and also some of the other foods that are New Mexican foods, like the chilies and the different spices that are there. Those are also tax-free. Our government was charging us tax in a food desert. That sister legislation was the legislation that was the first to eliminate tax on healthy food in a food desert. And so, we are trying to resolve our own issues with the expertise that we have. And, our group, our advocacy group, the Diné Community Advocacy Alliance, we were the first group to write as the people, not as attorneys, not as tribal council members, not as politicians writing legislation. It came from the people. And the thing, when we're addressing the unhealthy food, those words never existed in our language. And what are those words? Junk food, it never existed. So when we were talking about this to the youth, to the elders, talking about what junk food is, what are those words in our own language? We had to create that. And that was something that was just, it was very sensitive to us, because it never existed. And the words that we chose was Bejeweled. Iyan means food, But Bejeweled means the scraps, the oppressive food, the fast casual food, the prison food, all of those terms. That's what Bejeweled means. It means, the leftovers, it's such a word that, eats at your heart and your spirit, because it's so bad. And we know we have a 99% culture of Iyan Bejeweled. On the other hand, 1% access to Iyan Yahat's Egi, which I mentioned previously, the wholesome, healthful food. And so when we're talking about food, we're also talking about the history. We're talking about the current situation, the contamination. We're talking about, the laws, that are in place. And we're also talking about the lack of regulations of allowing so much junk food to exist. But in the treaty, and also when our people returned back from the concentration camp, they went back with the staples. That's when canned foods were introduced to our people. Where did we get Spam? Spam is prevalent in not only the indigenous cultures, but other cultures as well. The minority cultures that, they don't have refrigeration, and us, we, as Diné people, we have in our communities too, a lack of refrigeration, a lack of electricity, and a lack of access, to water and food. And so when they did return back, they returned back with those staples and returned back with canned foods, it still exists today. And so for us as Diné people, we're trying to reclaim our identity through healthy food, because we know it takes generations to change someone's eating habits. Now we have an addiction to unhealthy foods. And so now how do we reverse the addiction to healthful, wholesome foods, that Iyan Yahat's Egi? How do we, come back to that? How do we revitalize our culture, improve the health of our people? Because we see suffering every day. Every Navajo person is affected. We know someone who's affected by obesity and diabetes. I've seen family members, have amputations from diabetes. I've seen, family members reverse their diabetes from the Iyan Yahat's Egi. And this is the reason, we need to continue to promote the slow food activities in our communities, because we are slow food. But how do we embrace that, and how do we continue to promote that? And so there are all these different issues, that we're trying to address at one time. The Indigenous knowledge, and me speaking as a Diné woman, there are practices that are solutions to our health problems. And, in the early 1900s, there was only one Diné person who had diabetes. And now it's 1 out of 3 people. And this is something that we are trying to address. Food has a major impact. Food is medicine. And the knowledge that we have, the knowledge that is being passed forward, the knowledge that is being shared with us, is also sometimes being withheld. For example, for my own grandmother, recently she drew pictures. She's almost 90 years old. She drew pictures of the foods that she grew up eating. And never did she ever share that with us, because they were shunned, right? They were told not to share these things. They were also, told not to speak the language. My mother and father were sent to boarding school, and they were not allowed to speak the language, and their hair was cut, and, all of these different practices. But through this work that we're doing, and finally I'm realizing now that my grandmother is finally now knowing that the space and the place that we're providing is a healing space. And it makes me cry, because how many of our elders, how many of our mothers and fathers have knowledge and wisdom that is still being withheld inside here in their heart? And my mother drew the pictures, and she said, these are the foods that we are growing, the foods that we are eating. These are the ways that we are cooking. And she drew a picture, and it was a blue corn batter that was placed on top of the fire with no utensils, with no cooking ware, that was placed on top of the fire, baked with the ashes placed on top, and they made the form of a cake or a bread. And we've never seen that. And we're asking her now, can you show us before, anything happens to her, that can you show us? She's well, she's healthy. And, what are those practices? There are many practices in the indigenous communities that, we would like also for them to have the platform and the healing space that they're going to share, because there is so much knowledge and solutions to climate change, to resolving our health epidemics, and also to resolving, how to network, how to build relationships, how to be whole, how to be peaceful, how to be joyful. All of these things, we have those practices, because we remember from Standing Rock that as Indigenous people, from the outside, we are being called protesters, But from the Indigenous perspective, we were protectors. We said we're protectors. There are different personalities, there are different characteristics, there are different narratives that need to be told by Indigenous people, not on behalf of Indigenous people. We have to be sharing that narrative. My grandma should be sitting here sharing her story. You know, even if it's in a different language, in our Indigenous language, there is so much wealth and depth into all these different stories and experiences because it's still happening. We're still alive and we're still here. The big message from my tribal member, you know, that always emphasizes that we used to say we're the descendants of our ancestors, you know, to look back that we are the descendants of our ancestors. But now we have to look forward and start to say that we're the ancestors of our descendants. That gives us now the responsibility and also the civic responsibility that we are not living for us now, we're living for the future generation. We are planning, you know, for the future generations, that what we do now has a great impact. Will it have a great impact? Will we be a good ancestor? Will we be preparing those ways and the programs and the strategies that we're ensuring that those young people are going to be healthy, that they're going to have healthy food, that they're going to have a right to health, that they're going to have a right to healthy food access, all of these different things. We now have to look forward. You know, I talked about the history, but how is the history going to make a future for us? We have to make history now. We're solutionists. We have to create those solutions. We are human beings with great capacities, and as Indigenous people, we have a wealth of knowledge and wisdom that can be shared within our group and within our association, within the family, within our relatives, within our friends, and us as human beings. We have to start operating from the posture of our heart. If we don't take care of the earth is not going to take care of us.